Hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm showing it's right at 6 o'clock, so welcome. Looks like we've got about 12 people right now. Hang on a second, I've got to get on to my dog. Stop it, Trish. Sorry. My poodle, who is like 16 pounds, is telling the 50-plus pound collie, basically to do whatever she wants. So anyway, sorry about that. Welcome, guys. So tonight, I basically just wanted to do a couple things with you. We're going to go over some more elements of curriculum and specifically focus on curriculum development. Then I'm going to make sure we have plenty of time to answer any questions you have about finishing out the course, because believe it or not, next week is the end of everything. So lots to do tonight. So the first thing I want to talk about is we've talked many times about what is curriculum and how is it defined. And depending on who you ask, you're going to get a slightly different answer. But I found a new definition that I thought was both interesting and probably the most accurate definition. This particular researcher says that what curriculum is everything that happens in relation to the educational program. So what I want you to start thinking about is, we typically think of curriculum related to academic content, so math, science, English, social studies, etc. But beyond that, curriculum can also include extracurricular activities. So, we're pretty accustomed to seeing curriculum for the arts, but what about curriculum for other types of extracurricular activities? Should there be a curriculum for band? Should there be a curriculum for drill team or for cheerleading or for tennis? Some people would say that it should be, because in an effective school, that is very much a part of the educational program. We're also going to look at curriculum tonight from a slightly different perspective. We're all pretty accustomed to looking at curriculum and thinking about it from the perspective of education. But tonight we're going to talk about curriculum as it relates to the healthcare field. Curriculum, like I said, it's not something that belongs solely to education and educators. Effective companies oftentimes have curriculum and professional development and many of the same kinds of things that we use pretty constantly. So if you think about curriculum in the planning cycle, it has to start first with a needs assessment. If we don't know where we are and how we're doing, then we certainly have a problem in terms of curriculum. As I was reading some of the discussion forums this week, as well as some of the reflective responses, several of you talked about this. Hang on, did I just freeze? Oh, there we go. Sorry, I think my computer froze for a second. Some of you talked about how important it is to look at data when we're thinking about curriculum. And I will tell you, far too often that does not happen. I worked for two very large major school districts in Texas at one time in my life, as many of you know. And whenever we entered into the curriculum development process, I can tell you we never looked at data, which is really kind of stupid and sad. And then we wondered why we would get the outcomes that we got. I'll give you a great example. I wasn't involved in curriculum yet. I was still a high school principal, and we had this very large sort of convocation every year before school started with all the principals, directors, assistant superintendents, etc. And in a very large urban school district, that number totaled well over 500. And they were talking about and going over our data in terms of, how the schools had done, how the district had performed, etc. And we had not done very well in high school algebra. High school algebra is oftentimes the bane of the existence of most schools and districts. But we had really not done well at all. And I will never forget, one very brave high school principal, it was not me, stood up and she said, I have a real problem. My students didn't do well. And, my school stands a very high likelihood of being deemed as an unacceptable or low academically performing campus. And she said, I was assured over and over and over again that if we just followed the district's curriculum, my students would be prepared. And she said, and the reality is they were not at all prepared. And I remember thinking at the time, probably, I'm not saying the curriculum itself was bad, but it was not at all aligned to the needs of our students. And it was not aligned to that data. So remember, needs assessment must always be the first step in any kind of curriculum planning, curriculum review, and certainly curriculum redesign. Because if you don't do that, you will get what I call false positive results. We were a district that benchmarked pretty frequently, and we benchmarked against our curriculum. And guess what? We got great results on those benchmarks. But when it came time for the actual state assessment, we did dismally. And again, it's because of that false positive effect in that, yes, what was in our curriculum, we were doing well teaching it. Our students were succeeding with it. But the sad truth of the matter was it wasn't aligned to our state or any other national assessment. Huge, huge problem. Once you, though, have the data, you have to think about what does it look like in terms of design. And we talked about this before. Is it going to be a product-based curriculum? Is it going to be a process-based curriculum? How are we going to develop and design the curriculum that meets the educational philosophy of our school or our parish or district? How is it going to make sense for our teachers? Once you know what that design is going to look like and you choose one or more models to use, then you have to really think about the implementation of that curriculum. So again, it goes back to, Fenwick English is one of my favorite research people. We can have a great planned or intended curriculum, but if that doesn't match the taught curriculum and that taught curriculum doesn't match the assessed curriculum, then we have a real problem and breakdown. In terms of the curriculum cycle, most important part, you start with needs assessment, then you move into design and development, then you think about and plan for implementation, and then finally you have to conclude with assessment. And in an ideal world, that is a continuous cycle. It should happen frequently based on both formative assessment, but also at least yearly based on that summative assessment or state or national or local testing that we know we have to do. A lot of people also talk in the media all the time about we teach to the test. Yeah, we should be teaching to the test. In reality, sorry, I think my smoke alarm is about to die. I keep hearing this word beeping. If we're not making sure that our curriculum is aligned with the assessments, and if we're not teaching so students can be successful on that assessment, then we really, really need to think about what we're doing. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's my battery or somebody else's. So everybody look, and if you don't have your microphone on mute, go ahead and mute for us. And if you want to talk, you're welcome to raise your hand. My husband's looking at me like, from the other room, like, it is not our smoke alarm. So, okay, maybe it's not me. I don't know. So anyway, let's keep moving along. So in terms of curriculum development, again, so much of this is repetitive, but I want to make sure you really do understand it, because part of the problem you're going to face, whether you are a teacher leader, a department chair, a grade level chair, an assistant principal, on up the line all the way to superintendent. Most people do not know how to do curriculum development correctly. So a lot of times you're going to be the best, most informed resources on your campus. So it all starts with a series of questions, and this is part of that needs assessment. So what kind of a student do we want? We've been using and talking about backwards design, and backwards design, while it's designed specifically for curriculum, it really could be something that we use in other ways. So for example, I would suggest to you that the first step in good curriculum development, after you really know your data and you're able to analyze it and apply it, sit down and list out what it is that you want a student to know and be able to do by. So for example, by the end of first grade, all of the students from our school should know and be able to do, and literally list those skills or concepts. If you work at the high school, I would actually start with what is it we want a graduate to know and to be able to do, and then work backwards from there by grade level and by content. Also, too, don't forget that it's not only about content that you want students to know and be able to do, it is also about those soft skills that oftentimes our students leave schools without. Things such as collaboration, problem solving, conflict resolution. Those are also critical elements and should be woven throughout the curriculum and throughout our teaching. Once we know that, that is a great springboard to share with your parents. It is also a great springboard for students to benchmark their own progress, and so that you're embedding that data and that feedback throughout instruction as well as a part of your curriculum development. Also, too, we can't forget that every community is unique and different. So, for example, what is it that we are expected for our students to know and be able to do to master a state assessment, but also from our external stakeholders? I was in 2 very large urban school districts with a very high population of second language learners. So one of the things that our community expected was true bilingualism. So our English speakers, we wanted them to learn and become proficient in Spanish and vice versa. That was something that our community really valued. So we wove that into our curriculum. Also, too, are there other things that your particular state or parish expects that maybe is beyond what other people are doing within their curriculums? You also have to think about that, and it should be woven into that curriculum as well. What are the outcomes we expect? Is it, I see oftentimes people write a mission statement that, we want all of our students to be proficient on the state assessment. That's pretty short-sighted. We need our kids to have many more skills than that. So think about what that outcome really should be about. Also, sometimes a missing element of a curriculum is teaching and learning methodology. So, for example, I'll never forget, I was supervising principals, and I asked in one of our principals meetings, I said, what is our curriculum? And they all said, oh, it's the state standards. And I thought, oh my gosh, we've got an awful lot of work to do here if that's what we think the curriculum is for our schools. Because we also have to help teachers know what it is we expect in terms of teaching and learning. So for example, in one of my other classes, I was asking them about, I had them view a video of a teacher teaching and kind of give some feedback on what they saw and where this teacher needed to improve. And, I was pleasantly surprised that everybody kind of saw the same stuff and was making the same recommendations. But if we're not somewhat prescriptive about what we expect our teachers to use in terms of methodology, then, we're going to get this very uneven sort of curriculum implementation. So, for example, if you're in a school district and one of the best research practices for instruction is active student learning, or using learning as apprenticeship, those kind of things, that needs to be talked about and included in your curriculum. Sorry, I keep freezing. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, I keep freezing up here. I don't know what it is. My internet connection today is kind of funky at home. But again, if we're not, like I said, I'm not saying that, thou shalt, teachers, thou shalt do this at this time on this day, although I know of a successful school district in Texas that actually does that. They are that prescriptive, but give your teachers a little bit of freedom. But at the same time, if you're a school district that doesn't believe in worksheets and thinks that worksheets is not going to get your kids what they need, then make sure that you tell them that as part of the curriculum. Also, too, how are we going to assess learners? So you guys remember, we have to move beyond just the end of the year, doom or gloom, die or thrive kind of mentality when it comes to assessment. Assessment in an ideal world should happen every single day. And that data from that daily assessment, that formative, quick assessment, should be used to impact and change teaching the next day. Then finally, how do we establish those links to evaluation? So, in terms of, let me back up here. So, for example, I believe that there should be a curriculum for professional development, that it shouldn't just be hit or miss, or gosh, today I think we're going to do this, or oh, this year let's pick our 3 favorite topics and here's what we're going to do our professional development around. So one of the things that, I have seen used very successfully, and I will tell you it was highly successful when I implemented it at one of my schools, we would do classroom walkthroughs or observations or, whatever you want to call it. And we would do it with a team. So it wasn't just the principal or the assistant principal or the vice principal as an evaluator. It actually included teachers from maybe the same department or other departments. And we would go in and we had 3 very, very simple questions. Number 1, what do we observe? So that was that very objective information. Literally the teacher was presenting a lecture on blah, blah, blah. The students were, and like I said, very just factual. We didn't make any judgments. Then the next thing we would ask was, what are our wonderings or questions? So it might be something like, I'm wondering how the students knew the background vocabulary to be successful in completing the science experiment. And then finally, it was one thing that we would suggest needed to be improved. And I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience, but I've certainly had instances where someone would come in and observe me teaching, and they would they would give me one kudo, and then they would give me 15 things that I needed to fix or change. Well, guys, that's extremely overwhelming and probably impossible for a teacher to do effectively. So we would try to narrow it down to one thing. After we did our series of walkthroughs, so let's say that maybe we're going to go into, today we're walking through and we're looking at our English classes. We would take all of that information, no teachers' names on it, and we would compile it. And we also included kudos and celebrations. So here's all the great things that we saw. Here is what we saw most students involved in. And then finally, what it is that we feel like needs improvement. Yeah, somebody's got their mic on. So anyway, once we would do that, we would then compile, like I said, all of that information, and we would publish that to the faculty. And again, no names attached. So nobody could say, Tracy's class was this, or LaTanya's class was that, or Kim's class was this. It was just, we observed 6 classrooms today. Here are our observations. Here are our kudos and celebrations. Here are our wonderings or questions. And here's one thing that maybe we need to work on. And interestingly enough, you will see pretty quickly what professional development that teachers are needing. So for example, we were doing this in my school, and it didn't matter whether we were in a math classroom, an English classroom, a dance classroom, or a science classroom, whatever. We kept noticing that teachers did not know how to effectively teach vocabulary. We were doing those great, wonderful things like, here's your vocabulary list on Monday. Your homework for Monday night is to go home and define all these words. And then Tuesday night, you're going to use them in a sentence. And Wednesday night, you're going to write them 3 times. And on Thursday night, you're going to find them in a word search. And then on Friday, we're going to give you a quiz. And we were wondering why our SAT and our ACT verbal scores were not moving. Well, that was why, because that's not effective. So we developed, as part of our professional development planning, we use that data to actually create a curriculum on how to effectively teach vocabulary. So you see how when you use data and import that into a real scenario, suddenly all of our teachers were like, wow, we actually appreciate and understand why we're doing professional development, because that has been a need that has been identified through data for our entire campus. So that's how you link together curriculum, assessment, and data to make a good plan. So let's kind of switch gears. And like I said, we're going to talk about healthcare tonight, which is by no means my area of expertise. But I was doing some research and actually talking to Dr. Fortenberry, who's our director of healthcare, and Dr. Alexander, who is on staff at LSUS. Both of them are both MDs, JDs, and PhDs, so they're obviously extremely brilliant individuals. And I was talking to them about how curriculum is used in other fields and other disciplines. So we decided to kind of hone in on the idea around curriculum for adult psychiatry. And I asked them to kind of walk me through how they developed curriculum, not only for their classes, but also for, reason. Okay, sorry, here we go. Anyway, how they develop curriculum for their classes, as well as for professional development, ongoing training, their medical rounds, etc. So they said that one of the things they came up with was the idea that curriculum needed to equip people to work with others to assess, manage, and treat people with mental health problems while contributing to the development and delivery of effective services. So that was sort of their mission statement, and that's what was driving their curriculum development. The data that they were using was based on the number of individuals that they were seeing that were not progressing in their treatment. So what do they so they knew they had this data set. They had a high percentage, about 60% of the patients being seen were not progressing with their treatment. In the medical field, they expect 100%, effectiveness. 60% isn't good enough. It's not like you can, this is a terrible analogy, but it's sort of like if you go into surgery, surgeons are not okay if 60% of their patients die on the table. It's the same idea with the psychiatrist. So they also thought about, so we've got this data point, but we also need to look at what is it that our hospital expects, what is it that our community is expecting, and most importantly, what is it that we need to deliver to improve the effectiveness for our patients. So they defined, like we said, what those expectations were. Then they also talked about and thought about what the content needed to be, as well as how they were going to assess their progress. So they borrowed from, quite frankly, from education. So they started developing learning outcomes. And again, they're training their not only psychiatrists, but other professionals who are working with these patients. And they talked about what it was that was acceptable to use in terms of development of curriculum and delivery of services versus what wasn't. And hopefully we're all aware of these. For us, we call it Bloom's taxonomy. That you want to make sure that you're not writing a curriculum that's low rigor, low level. You want to write a curriculum that's high level, high rigor, and then you want to teach and instruct in the same realms. So for example, you don't want to ask someone to describe. That's low level, low rigor. It's also absolutely impossible to really measure. What you want them to do is to be able to describe, I'm sorry, I just said that wrong. I got it backwards. To compare, to analyze, to plan, to critically appraise, to evaluate, to synthesize, all of those high-level verbs. The way that they were going to make sure that people understood this and how they were going to help their patients was they were going to first start by asking a question that they could answer using those high-level verbs. So, for example, you compare your treatment now to previous treatment, for example. Based on what the patient said, as well as their records and other information that they had available, they were going to assess what evidence to decide if the patient was really laying it out or maybe withholding some information. Not only were they going to look at the evidence, they were going to appraise the evidence. And guys, that's something that I think we need to take more seriously in education. We don't often appraise our evidence. So what do I mean by that in terms of education? Very few people, truthfully, go through and analyze student work products. Oftentimes, we are giving students work that is not preparing them for success on a high level, high rigor assessment, test, or activity. So there is a very set way, and if you have other classes, we talk about that in others, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. But you really have to look at what we're asking students to do and make sure that it matches your expectations, your curriculum demands, and the level of assessment. So for example, on a state assessment, they may ask a student to do a comparison and a contrast between two reading passages. That's pretty common. But if we're asking them, when they are actually doing reading work with us in our classrooms, to do nothing more than to define the words, to find the main idea, to find the supporting details, and we're not asking them to compare across genres or stories or a poem versus a song lyric, then we are, again, not teaching at the level we need to. So that's how you appraise and assess whether or not work is really matching the needs of our students. Then finally, you have to actually go in, just like they did with the psychiatrists in the medical field, and apply that evidence. So again, let's switch back gears here for just a second, back to education. So one of the things that is highly successful and is a very high yield strategy when you're working together collaboratively with teachers is to ask everybody to bring in 3 pieces of student work. One that they would consider a great example. This is like my top student, my best product here. Here's an average one, and then maybe here's one that was not successful. And everybody brings them in, and you look at the curriculum and the demands, then you look at whatever you're using for assessment, If you have access to a released exam from your state or from your district or whatever, that's great. And then you look and you see, okay, so the assessment says, like I said, we want students to compare and contrast two different genres of literature. And then we look at how it's written in the curriculum. The first question becomes, is it written that way in the curriculum? If it's not, you know right there where your problem is. But let's assume that the two are aligned. If we're not then asking our students on those particular student work samples to do that, that becomes an area of disconnect and an area where we need to do improvements. The other part of it is, how did the teacher assess or grade that particular student work piece? So for example, if, maybe everything aligns, the task is pretty good, it's aligned to the curriculum, which is aligned to the assessment, but the teacher is giving straight A's to students who maybe really aren't mastering that particular content or objective at the level they need to. So you're always looking for alignment pieces. And if we're finding those aren't working or aligned, that's where we know we have to do adjustments. Another thing that you may want to think about, we did a lot of not only horizontal alignment, so alignment across the same grade level or content, we also did it vertically. And I will never forget this moment with my principals. And I was supervising, I had at that time 14, 15 schools, and they ranged in grade level from pre-K all the way through high school, through senior graduation. And so I had we were not doing as well as we wanted to holistically in writing. So I had everybody bring in the same thing, 3 work samples, my best, a mediocre one, and then, or I should say average, mediocre is a very negative term, average, and then a low sample by grade level. And we sat down and we literally lined them out from pre-K all the way through graduation. And I will never forget, one of my elementary principals looked at her pre-K, kinder, and first samples, and then she looked at this senior project that our seniors were doing. And we had, like I said, one that was stellar, superb, the valedictorian kind of one, then an average one, and then a low one. And she said, oh my gosh, if we don't ramp up the rigor and the level of expectation starting in pre-K, my students will never be able to achieve what is expected, even of the lowest level performance. Excuse me. Trish, stop. Sorry. My students will never be able to reach that level. It was too big of a leap. So you have to constantly be thinking about horizontal as well as vertical alignment, just like they were doing with the psychiatry patients that we were talking about. The other part of it is too, not only do you have to have that solid foundation in curriculum, you also have to make sure, as I said, that you are including the kinds of teaching strategies that are going to be high yield and highly successful. So, just like in psychiatry, they talked about what is it that we are expecting our doctors and our other caretakers to do with our patients. Well, they wanted it to be patient-centered, much like we would want it to be student-centered. They wanted it to be problem-based. You could talk all day about all the problems, if you've studied psychiatry, if it was all my mother's fault, if you're Freudian and all that sort of stuff. That doesn't really yield results. They realized pretty quickly that's why people weren't progressing. They were just living sort of in the past and not focusing on the problem. Same thing's true in education, guys. We don't have to constantly reteach the same things over and over and over. We have to identify the problem, fix it, and move forward. It also had to be very integrated. So while you may have a doctor treating a patient, you also have to have that support that is going to help that patient along the way. A great example is people who maybe have gone through, substance abuse programs. One of the things that they do is they double, triple stack them. And what I mean by that is they may have a doctor that's working with them. They may have a support group that's working with them. They may have an individual counselor or sponsor. They're sending them to AA or Narcotics Anonymous meetings. There are all of these support mechanisms that align together. We don't often do that in education. We sort of expect the teacher to be the be-all, end-all. And guys, we've got to really do a better job if we want to have effective curriculum and instruction to pull in additional supports for our students. So that might include community. It might include other sorts of things that can support our students, even through technology, for example. And of course, you want to make sure that it needs to be systemic and based on what is going to be the most efficient and helpful for our students. We also want to make sure too, like they did in this particular example, where we're spiraling the curriculum. So it's this constant idea of, like I said, that cycle. Needs assessment, design and development, implement, assess. Oh gosh, this is going great. This isn't, so we got to keep going. We've got to look at our data, and then we're going to do more development and design. You know, in an ideal world, we would wish that, sorry, I'm trying to read the chat too. You know, I wish that we could say it's one and done. We did great curriculum development this summer and we're done. Doesn't work that way, guys. You will never finish curriculum development either. Okay, so I'm going to take just a breather here for a second. Let me read this real quick. Yeah, so Anne Marie's asking that, you know, should we do a textbook adoption and follow it with fidelity? Okay, let me just say this to you. There are 3 states in the United States that textbook companies align their curriculum to. New York, California, and Texas. New York and California both have gone to Common Core. Texas, being Texas, you know, they're always wanting to secede from everything. They did not adopt Common Core. Textbooks are written to meet the standards for those 3 states. So if you were following a textbook adoption with fidelity, you would probably have your students do great if you live in Texas or New York or maybe even California. It's highly unlikely that what you are expected to do with your standards in Louisiana or Mississippi or Oklahoma or Arkansas or Delaware or wherever, you're going to find everything you need in a textbook. A textbook is a great resource, but it is not the be-all, end-all. And the idea that, you know, we had, gosh, when I first started teaching 10,000 years ago, was that you started on page 1 of the textbook and you were successful, you made it all the way to the last page before the school year ended. The way a textbook can be helpful is that it does provide some guidance and resources, particularly for inexperienced teachers. But the best and most successful school districts or school parishes or whomever systems are those that you start with your standards and objectives. You look at and see how they're aligned on the state assessments. You know, for example, I'll pick on Texas just because that's where most of my experience is. But, you know, Texas puts out what they call blueprints that tells you for each objective how many questions there's going to be on the test regarding that. So, you know, there's some that are really heavy. There may be 5 or 6 questions on a state assessment about objective B, whereas objective J, there's only 1. So you do a good alignment between the two. Then once you have that, you develop your curriculum around that. So if it's a high stakes, high tested objective or set of objectives, you're going to spend more time on that. Whereas the textbook doesn't do that for you guys. Now, the other part of it is too, if it's a high stakes standard or one that you know your kids maybe don't have the background to be successful on, you may want to tear that textbook apart and skip around. Now, sometimes that's hard based on, you know, they may need some foundational skills like in math or maybe, you know, history. You certainly, I mean, I guess you could talk about World War II and then go back and talk about the Revolutionary War. But you're going to have to make sense for the kids chronologically. You know, it's just that, like I said, a textbook just doesn't really cover everything. And teachers who rely solely on that, they're often surprised when their students don't do well. You know, you're the expert. You know what your kids need. The other part of it is, too, textbooks oftentimes teach the same concepts that have been taught multiple times. You know, and oftentimes you have to go in and really get into more depth or complexity, Or you can look at and see, my students have already mastered that. I'm not going to spend this much time on it. I'm going to move forward. So that's why, like I said, the most important person in a school, it's not the students, it's not the principal, it's the teacher, because you guys have to make sense of what kids need, etc. Okay. Yeah, so I'm a huge believer in curriculum design. Yeah, you know, like I said, let me give you another very concrete example. When I was a high school principal, my teachers kept telling me, we were falling, hang on just a second, I'm going to lock my dog out. She's getting on my last nerve. Just a second. Go. 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 Sorry, I have a 14-year-old poodle who's extremely grouchy. And then I have an 8-month-old collie who, you know, thinks everything should be playtime, and they fight. But anyway, so my teachers kept telling me that, Tracy, the curriculum is not good, our district curriculum. It's not preparing our students. And they said, if you will just trust us, give us a year and let us do what we know needs to be done with the curriculum. The parts that we know to teach, that we feel like are pretty good, we'll use. The parts that are terrible, we're going to throw out. And they said, we promise we'll get results. Well, you know, despite my trepidation and everything. Hey, Valerie, can you mute us?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So we kind of took that leap. So for 1 year, they didn't use the district's curriculum and did their own thing. Our achievement results went up 46% in a single year. Because my teachers knew what the students needed, they went through the right processes, they used our data, all of those things made a huge difference. That's why I'm not the biggest fan of textbook adoptions as the curriculum. All right, so what questions, comments, or concerns do you have? Is somebody trying to jump in, guys? I can't always see. Okay, well, I'm going to try. Let's see if I can do this effectively on this little thing here. Hang on. Let me go back. I want to share my screen with y'all for just a second. Okay. All right. So I've had a couple of people with questions about the individual assignment. So can y'all see my screen okay now? This is the assignment for the individual project. Guys, many of you are making this way, way, way harder than you need to. Literally, all I want you to do is to think about a long-term plan for any particular subject you want, any particular objective. I have no vested interest in that. I just want you to get comfortable with how you start curriculum planning. So this is the template that's sort of after you've done your needs assessment and, you know, all this stuff we talked about, and you've defined your curriculum model that you're going to use and those pieces. This is where you begin. So for example, the term, well, that could be that it's the first 6 weeks. It could be the first semester. It could be 3rd grade, whatever. Class level obviously is, you know, pretty self-explanatory. Subject, etc. Aims. Simply tell me what it is you're hoping to accomplish. So this may be your actual objective or one of the goals from your curriculum. Then you're going to break it down into strands because, as we all know, objectives usually are things like students will be able to analyze, synthesize, and compare and contrast the Revolutionary War with World War II. So you're going to have to break that down. Okay, that's something you can't, obviously, they're going to have a lot of background knowledge about, you know, the Revolutionary War, World War II, whatever. Break it down there. Just an overview. And you notice this is a single page because guess what? That's all it should be. If you're going to give me a 5 or 6 page project, you've probably gone into too much detail because this is a long term. Okay? What are those skills that need to be developed to be able to do that? Remember how we talked about a good curriculum has approaches and methodologies? So tell me what kinds of strategies you want teachers using in their classroom. what are their resources, and then finally, what is the differentiation? So what are you going to do for the gifted and talented, for maybe your students who struggle with reading, etc.? How are you going to assess it? Then a lot of people did not understand this question, linkage and integration. So what that may be is, let's assume that you're doing your long-range planning around social studies, and like I said, Revolutionary War and World War II. Maybe part of the integration of that might be that you're going to ask students in English to read The Red Badge of Courage. Okay, so how would you pull together some of these elements so students are seeing it across different content areas? Okay, make sense? Seriously, you guys have no questions for me tonight? Woohoo!
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so going into this, you just said, the textbook adoption, Caddo Parish, we went guidebook 3 through 5, mandatory guidebook. How would you then take it to, how would you handle the uppers, the higher people, when you know the gaps that are there and that there will have to be outside resources pulled in that's not connected to the content or the strands?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I think it depends, honestly, Casey, on the personality and leadership style of your principal.
This is even went higher than the principal.
No, I understand now.
Okay.
So going back to my example, I was very comfortable as a principal and sort of relished in the role of, if the district said go left, I'd love to go right and prove them wrong.
Okay.
So I was willing to take on that risk on behalf of my teachers. So if somebody came in from central office, which they did often, and questioned what we were doing, sort of the standard answer was, you need to talk to Tracy. And I would take the hit for that. Because at the end of the day, as long as you're getting results and you're getting that high performance that everybody wants, they will eventually leave you alone about it. The other thing that we did was we became experts, and I will give my teachers tons, and they get all the credit for this. They would identify those gaps, and they would keep log of where there was maybe errors or missing elements or problems or whatever, and we would compile all of that and submit it to our district superiors. And sometimes it's taken kindly, sometimes it's not, but at the end of the day, they finally started listening to us because we were able to get results that other schools weren't getting with similar populations. And so they were kind of like, oh, wow. Now, I will tell you, 2 years later, and my teachers, sort of hated me for it, but because my teachers became so good at analyzing curriculum and applying it appropriately in the classroom, literally every content area when we did curriculum development or textbook adoption in the district, my teachers were on those committees. Like I said, they hated me for it because the teachers were like, I don't want to do this. I'm like, you've got to, because otherwise they're going to keep giving us garbage. And, we had to really appeal to their sort of altruistic sides. We have to take care of kids beyond just our school. And then our reputation became so strong that we ended up with teachers on practically every state level committee, along the way. So it's sort of that idea of, am I willing to jump off the bridge here and this is a hill I'm going to die on? But, if it's about kids and they don't like it, then, either they'll adapt and accept based on your results, or quite honestly, it's time to look for a new place to go. Because it should be about the kids and success at the end of the day. And no curriculum is perfect. I know it's hard to tell somebody their baby's ugly, and that's how people feel sometimes about the curriculum they've written, but sometimes it's an ugly baby, and you just have to tell them in a nice, gentle way that it's not the best ever.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, guys? Any questions about assignments or anything like that? You feeling okay? Feeling overwhelmed? No? Okay. All right, well, unless you guys have, I'll give you 15 minutes of your lives back tonight. So next week, we do have a Zoom meeting scheduled. I'm not going to present. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. You're, finishing up. Really, it's just going to be so, if you have questions or comments or concerns, we'll touch base with everybody, but expect it to be, unless we just have a lot of questions, a little bit shorter meeting than normal. Okay. All right, guys. Well, have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful summer night, and we'll see you next week.